Hello, and welcome to Shades of Murder. I am your host, Alita Caldwell. In this podcast, I discuss cases of murder from around the world and throughout history, attempting to unravel the layers of darkness that help make humans into monsters. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific, and at times very graphic, and disturbing details of the case. This show is not intended for all audiences, and listener discretion is strongly advised. In the last episode, I discussed the horrifying and tragic murder of 9-year-old Elizabeth Olden and her unexpected killer, 15-year-old Alyssa Bustamante. This is the second piece of the shocking true story of a child murderer who, by all accounts, was a child herself when she committed this heinous, vicious crime. It would be so easy, even lazy, to call Alyssa Bustamante an evil monster and end the discussion and her story there. This is what most people, including fellow true crime podcasters, do when discussing her and this horrible, tragic case. However, the reason I wanted to cover her case, and I chose to extend it to 2 episodes, is that she is a compelling offender to me for multiple reasons. Please be aware that I am not a psychiatrist, nor am I a licensed therapist. However, I do have a degree in criminology, and hopefully it has been demonstrated to you, my dear listeners, by now, that I conduct extensive research for every episode. I think it's critical that as a society, we attempt to comprehend how and why an individual, especially a child or youth, can commit inherently evil acts. It is easy to label persons who murder as monstrosities, whom we can't possibly relate to on any level. When we do this, we dissociate ourselves from them and their crimes. In this goal to separate them from us, we have created an almost mythological aura around serial killers and other similar depraved, violent offenders. I think in some ways it's easier to deal with the darkness that exists within others if we place them into compartments of evil, rather than acknowledge that most of them are shattered individuals who weren't capable of processing and handling the trauma and abuse they were dealt with in life in any normal or healthy manner. The criminal profile and story of Alyssa Bustamante is important to know and discuss, not because of her shocking and vile crimes, but because of how much of an anomaly this young woman truly is. First of all, her youth and gender made her highly unlikely to commit such a heinous, premeditated crime by making her sister Emma an accomplice and leaving behind a trail of evidence for law enforcement to find. Alyssa Bustamante exhibited arrogance, sloppiness, and a lack of organization. This was likely a reflection of her youth, in particular her impulsiveness, recklessness, and poor judgment, all well-known characteristics of a developing, typical teenager's brain. If it weren't for these crucial mistakes, Alyssa Bustamante may never have been caught. Secondly, although some signs point to her being a psychopath, other factors and traits don't. Don't get me wrong, Alyssa Bustamante deserves to be in prison for the rest of her life. Despite her age at the time of the offense, she will most likely continue to be denied parole based on the evidence of premeditation, the degree of brutality of the crime, and the victim having been an innocent and helpless child. However, it is critical to discuss her from a criminological view and analyze the various aspects of her life and behavior, which culminated in this tragedy. Alyssa Bustamante was described as being a very bright and clever girl in a sneaky kind of way, but who openly struggled with her depression. She had never been in trouble at school or involved in any sort of juvenile delinquency outside of a few incidents of not being where she said she would be. There was an occasion where she snuck off to a music concert in St. Louis, and she spent the night out in the woods a few times without her grandparents knowing. However, she had never had any encounter with the justice system before being arrested for first-degree murder. Her grades were above average, and at the time of the offense, she was in the top third of her class. Alyssa Bustamante did not fit any kind of violent offender profile, especially for a girl. It is a criminal fact that males commit far more homicides than females. Official crime data from 2023 revealed that of the 21,504 known homicide offenders, 14,327 were male, compared to only 1,898 females. Interestingly, there were an additional 5,279 perpetrators of homicide whose gender was unidentified or unknown. This equates to approximately 0.88% of all murders being committed by females. This is an extremely low percentage of homicides being committed by women and girls, which is why when females commit murder, it is still perceived as a shocking and very rare incident. Women and girls who commit murder overwhelmingly do so for the means of utility, usually for the gain of money. Studies on female offenders reveal that they also kill primarily for means of survival. It could be to survive violent abuse from an intimate partner in a moment of self-defense, or their desire to end prolonged abuse. And sometimes it's just to survive the streets. Girls who kill share very similar traits and characteristics to women in terms of their motivations, and even fewer studies have been conducted on them. This is very unfortunate and irresponsible since murders committed by girls and younger women appear to have become increasingly more common in recent decades. Other females kill in what are described as crimes of passion. These incidents involve either their lover, boyfriend, girlfriend who has rejected or betrayed them, or their love rival, and sometimes both. An example of this kind of killer would be Tennessee death row's Krista Pike, who brutally slayed a young woman in 1995, whom she believed was after her boyfriend. For some female offenders, the motivation can stem from a darker, more psychopathic place. Sometimes it can arise from a desire for power, control, and domination. It may derive from the desperate need for attention, or even a bizarre sense of mission-driven killing. Women and girls tend to murder those closest to them. They prey on the weak and the vulnerable, in particular when the motivation is financial. Female juvenile murderers are by far the rarest of violent offenders. Most of these killings involve crimes of passion, as aforementioned, where envy and jealousy of another female are the primary motive, and they often involve more than one offender. This kind of murder can be seen in the horrific attack of 12-year-old Shonda Scherer in Indiana by a group of girls, led by the jealous 16-year-old Melinda Loveless. In the case where the victims are family members, they tend to revolve around a forbidden love interest. Typically, these events involve a younger female who becomes obsessed with a much older male suitor, whom the parents attempt to keep apart. This can lead to further obsession and eventually a plan to eliminate those who are interfering in the relationship. In the twisted perception of the love-struck teen, the only way to be with a man they love is to kill their parents, and sometimes even their siblings. This kind of family killing was demonstrated in the case of 16-year-old Erin Caffey from Texas in 2008. All three of these examples have become quite notorious in the world of true crime because they were so disturbing, brutal, and most of all, extremely rare. Another more well-known scenario involves a young female, at the behest of the older male partner, who becomes involved in killing and sometimes even the torture of another individual or multiple persons. This has been demonstrated through various killer duos throughout history, in particular serial killer couples. Whether the female is a willing and active participant or a compliant accomplice, they traditionally commit the crimes to please their male partner or to prevent him from causing them harm. Or at least, that is what most of these family offenders claim to be their motivation. Such an infamous case is illustrated through Canada's Karla Homolka. What is almost unheard of and the most shocking to hear is when a young woman kills someone of her own accord, her own free will, her own premeditated, vile plan to take another's life for pleasure. Alyssa Bustamante did not fit into the typical profile of a delinquent teen, much less a cold-blooded, sadistic murderer. And yet there were many, many alarming signs of pending violence, up to and including her potential for homicide. Born to a drug-addicted teen mother and abusive father, Alyssa Bustamante was exposed to domestic violence, her mother's sexual activity with multiple men inside the home, and substance abuse. Her mother had a criminal record which included mainly petty crimes like drug possession and a DUI. Her father was sentenced to 10 years for felony assault and had not been in her life since she was a very young child, except for the occasional letter from prison. Alyssa and her 3 younger siblings were faced with a life of continuous hardship. Her mother had run away from their home, abandoning her 4 small kids on multiple occasions. This was all before Alyssa had turned 7. It was during this time that her grandparents felt they had no other choice but to intervene and help. They didn't want the children split up into foster care, and so they took it upon themselves to care for them all. Since her mother was neglectful and randomly disappeared on them, and her father was in prison, her grandparents were granted guardianship over all 4 young kids, Alyssa being the eldest. One particular time when her mother took off, it had dire consequences. On Labor Day weekend 2007, 13-year-old Alyssa Bustamante was found unconscious. She had been discovered collapsed in the shower by her grandmother after swallowing a large bottle of Tylenol. Her arms had hundreds of tiny cuts on them made by a razor blade. The girl had carved the word hate into one of them. She survived the suicide attempt and was sent to a healthcare facility for evaluation and treatment. There, Alyssa Bustamante was given a prescription for Prozac, a common antidepressant, and it seemed to do its job. For a while. Alyssa's grandparents were very religious, and although they made sure that she and her siblings were well taken care of, I don't know how their relationships were. Were they affectionate and open with her? Did they discuss the trauma and abuse she had experienced as a child and how she was suffering emotionally and psychologically as a result? Alyssa regularly attended their Mormon church and did so right after brutally slaying a child, as recorded in her diary. It was clear that religion didn't seem to make any impact on her moral compass. If anything, she mocked it. I wonder if her grandparents thought that if she read the Bible and went to church enough, it would miraculously fix her issues and save her from the looming darkness. There were many signs that Alyssa Bustamante was spiraling down a dark path, which were essentially ignored by those in her life, and in the very least, were not taken seriously enough. Everything Alyssa Bustamante portrayed on social media, the words and pictures that decorated her bedroom walls, and especially those inside her journal, was strong evidence of a young girl who was obsessed with death and violence and wanted to die. Earlier in the year at her 15th birthday party, Alyssa Bustamante made a shocking and disturbing statement to her once best friend, Jennifer Meyer. According to Jennifer, out of nowhere, Alyssa pulled her aside and said to her, and I quote, "I just wonder what it would be like just to kill someone, see the life just drain out of someone. I wonder what it would feel like, that type of power, to take that away from someone." Jennifer just thought at the time she was being weird and dark and didn't take her words seriously. A week before she murdered 9-year-old Elizabeth Olton, Alyssa's cell phone charger was dead one night. She was all alone in her room, and she couldn't talk to anyone about the depression and pain she was drowning in. She wrote in her diary, and I quote, "If I don't talk about it, I bottle it up, and when I explode, someone's going to die." On Twitter, she wrote that there must be some reason for all this pain. All of these expressions of her rage, sadness, and darkness were in full display for not only those closest in her circle to see and hear, but for the entire world, if they had listened. She did not hide her sickness, but rather she played it up, almost reveling in it, crafting a dark, dramatic, and alluring image of herself. This resulted in a harrowing persona of how she wanted to present herself and what she wanted to project onto society. Alyssa Bustamante has been described as a thrill killer, in large part because the main detective stated that the reason she murdered Elizabeth Olten was because she wanted to know how it felt to kill. As I pointed out in the first episode of this case, these exact words were never spoken by the offender to law enforcement. However, since she did express this specific desire to kill to one of her closest friends, it is impossible to deny that her main motivation was to experience the power and pleasure of taking a life. This kind of offender is the rarest of them all. They defy all understanding and possible explanation as to what triggers this kind of thrill-killing behavior, especially in a young woman. So what exactly defines the actions and profile of a thrill killer? Thrill killing, a type of murder committed for the reasons as defined by its name, for the thrill of taking a life. Sounds pretty straightforward as to the primary motivation behind such an offender's purpose for killing. However, what makes an individual into a thrill killer is seemingly much more complex. For the majority of society, we struggle to comprehend, much less understand, such an act and the type of person who commits it. Thrill killers are a typology that was developed to understand different types of serial killing, specifically those committed by males. This type of murderer kills to obtain gratification and pleasure through the act of killing. Thrill killers are driven by the act alone. They are excited and energized by the pain and terror they can inflict on their victim. Traditionally, they are not interested in the body post-mortem. Unlike other sadistic killers, they don't mutilate or play with a corpse. They rarely commit any sexual acts during, much less after, the kill. Psychologists have observed that their thrill from killing is intertwined with the power and control they exert over their victims. People who kill for these reasons very often are associated with severe childhood trauma, specifically abuse. They suffer from feelings of unworthiness and have a great desire for power and control. This trauma has been noted to desensitize some individuals toward pain and violence, leading them to lack empathy and have minimal attachment to others. Women who kill for the thrill, who are stimulated by the act of murder and torture, are extremely uncommon. They are pretty much non-existent. There are very few known female thrill killers, or at least those who have been properly identified. Multiple murderer Joanna Dennehy of the United Kingdom has been deemed by some to be a thrill killer. Jane Toppin, the 19th century serial killer nurse of Boston, whom I have covered in a previous episode, openly expressed how she murdered for pleasure. Even the infamous Aileen Wuornos has been described as a thrill killer, although I personally don't agree with this label to define her motivations. Needless to say, most women who have been described under this motivation have almost always been part of a murdering duo, usually headed by a male. The motivations of Alyssa Bustamante's were undoubtedly sadistic and pleasure-driven, based on her journal entry after she murdered 9-year-old Elizabeth Olten. Alyssa Bustamante suffered severe trauma, abuse, and neglect before she was even born. The teenager struggled with her inner demons and battled against depression and feelings of worthlessness. She did not feel of any value, and she lacked control over her life. All of these characteristics define what is known about thrill killers. In the act of luring in or stalking their victim, taking them by surprise, inflicting brutality upon the individual, and causing the person terror and pain, they regain their sense of power, strength, and control. The pain and suffering that define their very existence is now erased, at least temporarily, by causing pain and suffering to another and having the power to end their life. Upon close analysis, though, I tend to think her motivations were much more complicated than simply killing for the thrill. Alyssa Bustamante was an extremely disturbed teenage girl who was fascinated with death and violence, and the concept of killing herself was projected onto her victim. I think to some extent she was trying to get rid of her self-hatred by victimizing the most innocent. Everyone has labeled this girl an evil monster. Were her actions those of one? Undoubtedly, yes, and there were clear signs of her being psychotic. But is she evil? Is she a psychopath? Or is she a tragic result of her upbringing? Perhaps a little bit of both. Psychopathy is a mental disorder that is manifested from a culmination of factors, believed to be likely caused by genetic factors, which help to mold and influence cognitive development and personality traits. It is also a reaction to social and environmental elements. Psychopathy as a clinical construct is defined by a pattern of interpersonal, emotional, and behavioral traits that an individual exhibits. Considered one of the most serious of the personality disorders, the recovery rate of individuals suffering from psychopathy is very low, and the effects it can have on a personal and social level are extensive. The prevalence of psychopathy is thought to affect anywhere between 0.5 to 1% of individuals in society. However, it is believed that as high as 20 to 25% of all prisoners could be diagnosed with the disorder. Research indicates that psychopaths are responsible for more than half of all serious crimes committed. Studies on psychopathy in men and women reveal that the condition is very rare in females. However, along with male prisoners, female prisoners often exhibit signs of the disorder. One study showed that as high as 17% of female prisoners could be diagnosed as psychopathic. This is in comparison to roughly 31% of male prisoners. Emotional traits of a psychopath include flat affect, lack of empathy, remorse or guilt, and egocentricity. Alyssa Bustamante fully exhibits these traits when she writes in her diary about how killing Elizabeth Olten made her feel. There is zero expression conveyed about what a horrible thing it was to do. Elizabeth Olten is not a child she murdered, but she merely becomes an object that was used to fulfill her homicidal desires. Interpersonal characteristics of a psychopath show themselves in acts of arrogance, impulsiveness, lack of responsibility, grandiose sense of self, and manipulation. Alyssa Bustamante's act of killing was not impulsive since she planned to commit murder based on her preemptive digging of the graves, but her selection of Elizabeth Olten does not appear to have been planned, at least not on that particular day. During the interrogation video, Alyssa Bustamante attempts to manipulate the detective and the juvenile officer into believing her version of events on the day she killed Elizabeth. She is bold, confident, even arrogant, while she sits back in the chair with ease, casually painting a story she is trying to sell them. The behavior of a psychopath has been observed to show dismissal of social norms and rules, and display scary, violent, and irresponsible behavior. Alyssa Bustamante portrayed herself across social media as someone who rebelled against society's expectations, especially expectations of a young female. She chose dramatic, often violent imagery and expressions to depict her persona, whose main purpose appeared to be for the attention it received. The characteristics and traits of psychopathy vary from person to person, but there are a few core features. These include an uncaring temperament, boldness, and social dominance, in addition to disinhibited behavior. An uncaring temperament is the social and emotional foundation of being a psychopath. These kinds of individuals exhibit no remorse, regret, or guilt over their actions. They are liars, manipulators, and use people to get what they want. Secondly, they are known to be risk takers. Their appearance and demeanor is one full of confidence, even arrogance, and they fail to avoid behavior that in the past has already led to problems. The third core trait is disinhibited behavior. This involves actions and behavior that are spontaneous, random, and often unplanned. These individuals fail to uphold their promises or commitments, including work or school or to their personal life. There is a divide amongst researchers on whether or not criminal behavior is a key element of psychopathy or if it is a consequence. As in most areas of criminology, the majority of studies conducted on psychopathy have been focused on males. However, the research performed on male psychopaths versus females have revealed some interesting differences. Research on psychopathy has been conducted in two distinct ways. One school of research has been focused on behavior where the other is centered around personality. The behavioral approach is the one which the APA, or the American Psychiatric Association, employs in its diagnostic system, also known as the DSM-4, where psychopathy falls under antisocial personality disorder. This diagnosis primarily includes concepts of behavior with emotional traits associated to them, but it is not a prerequisite to the diagnosis. This category far exceeds the realm of psychopathy and would encompass most criminals. The other school is based upon personality and is represented in the World Health Organization diagnosis of dissocial personality disorder under their International Statistical Classification System, also known as the ICD. This disorder is characterized by individuals who pose a sharp resistance to the expected behavior and codes of conduct. They are indifferent toward these rules and norms and lack empathy. They fail to experience guilt as the rest of us do, and they lack the capacity to feel remorse. This kind of individual does not respond to negative reinforcement of behavior, such as punishment, which does not deter or change their bad behavior. They also have a tendency to blame others for their actions, and they are at constant conflict with society. It is estimated that 1/3 of people who would be diagnosed as antisocial meet the criteria for psychopathy. The latter criteria defined by dissocial personality disorder leans toward a closer match to the definition of psychopathy, although neither school thoroughly covers the term. How is psychopathy even measured and thus diagnosed? You may be wondering. The most common and validated tool is the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, which includes a checklist of 20 items to which a patient is assigned a score of 0 to 2 based on how closely they align to each trait. These include many of the well-known characteristics and behavior of a psychopath, such as lack of guilt, no empathy, superficiality, shallow affect, grandiosity, lying, parasitic lifestyle, manipulation, impulsiveness, and adolescent crime, among others. Amongst researchers, the accepted threshold for psychopathy is 30. The differences between genders and psychopathy are noted as being significant in the ways the disorder manifests itself. Researchers Farouzen and Cook suggest that there are 4 points in the ways these differences surface. These include behavior, interpersonal characteristics, underlying psychological mechanics, and different social norms. Female psychopaths are often impulsive and characterized by behavioral problems. They demonstrate this mainly by running away, displaying signs of self-destructive and self-harming behavior, and various acts of manipulation. Regarding behavior, whereas men tend to run scams and commit crimes of fraud, female psychopaths tend to use their feminine wiles, so to speak, to manipulate others. In other words, they flirt to get their way, or at least attempt to. Their criminal behavior leans towards committing acts of fraud and theft rather than violence. Forms of aggression vary between men and women who are psychopathic, with females being aggressive verbally and within their relationships, and males being more physically aggressive. These acts of aggression by females can occur through manipulating others in their social circle, with the goal to oust or reject their targeted victim. It also manifests itself in threats of self-harm. It has been observed how female psychopaths do not necessarily share the traits of superficiality or grandiosity like their male counterparts do. It has been suggested that this may be due to differences in culture and their upbringing. The underlying psychological condition and its motivations also differ between men and women. It has also been discussed how social norms affect the perception of psychopathic traits differently between males and females. A study of female inmates revealed that they are diagnosed with emotionally unstable personality disorder much more often than antisocial personality disorder, which is a medical term for the presence of 2 or more medical conditions existing in a patient, is thought to possibly be a link with female psychopathy. Few studies have been done in this area, but what does exist suggests that both male and female psychopaths are suffering from more than one medical condition. In the case of Alyssa Bustamante, we can see how her depression, anxiety, ADD, borderline personality, in addition to her antisocial or dissocial personality disorder, are all strong evidence of her being inflicted with comorbidity. This is an interesting concept that warrants much more research. to possibly understand the complexities of the brain and thus the personality and behaviors of someone afflicted with more than one medical condition. When psychopathy begins to merge, differs between the genders as well. Where males typically exhibit signs as early as childhood, females initially show symptoms in adolescence. Young women display relational forms of aggression, which are brought on by jealousy, manipulation, self-injury or harming, and verbal aggression. At first glance, Alyssa Bustamante doesn't fit the typical profile of a psychopath. However, when you read about and consider some of the distinct differences between male and female psychopaths, the patterns strongly align with her personality and behavior. She was an abandoned, neglected child whose grandparents seemed to love her and take care of her, but they didn't really try to understand her. Maybe this is simply a reflection of the large generation gap and or their being highly religious. There were so many signs, both physical and psychological, that were screaming for serious intervention. Placing someone on Prozac is not sufficient enough treatment for someone suffering from this degree of mental illness and suicidal ideation. I don't blame her grandparents at all. But the healthcare facility and the therapist really failed when they let this girl's psychosis slip through the cracks. During her stay at the hospital, she allegedly conveyed to one of the counselors that she wanted to kill someone, and she had set her eyes upon Elizabeth Olten. Elizabeth Olten was everything Alyssa Bustamante was not. She was a girly girl who had a loving home with a mother and siblings who adored her. She was from a normal and healthy, functioning family. Elizabeth Olten was full of light, hope, and purity. And Alyssa Bustamante's twisted and depraved mind, which was overrunning with thoughts of self-hatred and darkness, she sought to destroy something beautiful, someone entirely innocent. There has been much speculation as to who her initial intended victims were, since Alyssa Bustamante had dug 2 graves. Some believe that the graves were dug for her twin brothers. This theory surfaced mainly due to how Alyssa expressed a sadistic pleasure at seeing them electrocute themselves in the previously mentioned YouTube video. However, I don't think that reaction was intended to mean she actually wanted her little brothers hurt, much less dead. I mean, how many millions upon millions of YouTube and TikTok videos demonstrate teens and preteens making light of themselves and or their friends getting harmed or hurt in some capacity by acting out in reckless, idiotic ways? They intentionally create videos for that primary purpose. Now, the other individual some people believe Alyssa initially set out to murder was her little sister Emma. This theory is mainly based upon the crude, violent depiction of her little sister in the drawing found in her bedroom. But we don't know the context around the sketch, and by all accounts, Emma was not afraid of her big sister. From what we do know of how Alyssa treated her younger siblings, at least according to her grandmother, she cared for them as if she was their parent, and she did not abuse them or cause them any intentional harm. That Alyssa Bustamante primarily placed harm upon herself is what makes her distinct from many other psychopaths. But after reading the research, self-injury or self-harming in female psychopaths appears to be pretty common. A typical psychopath is defined by their highly narcissistic personality, their grandiose sense of self. Someone who cuts themselves all over and has attempted to kill themselves does not seem to fall within this trait. However, when you look at her social media presence, there is some indication of narcissism there. There were signs of her desire for attention, to craft an image of herself, this alluring darkness around her, flirtatious and seductive in a bizarre, gothy teenage sort of way. They are bold, in-your-face, glamorized depictions of violence. The images of her are not frightening in a traditional sense. They are over the top, dramatic, as if she is simply playing to the camera. Alyssa Bustamante was an attractive young woman, and she expressed a sense of confidence and playfulness in her online presence. In this regard, she does match the narcissistic characteristic of psychopathy. Now, these images have been given far too much attention in the press. After her twisted attack and grisly killing of a child, all of her past posts and writings somehow became indicative of her sickness. But was that just an after-the-fact perception? If she had never committed this horrific crime and bragged about it in her diary, would these images and videos ever have been at the forefront, used to prove how depraved and weird and dark and evil the young woman was? I think it's pretty safe to say that there are countless teenagers, in particular of the goth, emo, or alternate lifestyle or look, that portray themselves in bizarre, even creepy and dark, sinister ways. That is not an indication or evidence that they are violent or have the tendency to commit homicide. In my opinion, it is not the dark imagery or words that make Alyssa Bustamante terrifying. Rather, it is when she looks and behaves like a normal teenage girl that she is the most disturbing. That is why I selected the photo I did of her for the cover. It is much scarier to see her smiling. The picture of a cute 15-year-old small-town girl who was plotting to murder a neighborhood child. Alyssa Bustamante's psychopathy truly shines through during her interrogation video. It is truly astonishing and almost surreal how this 15-year-old girl smirks, jokes, and rocks easily back in the chair while talking to a homicide detective about a missing girl. She shows not a care or worry in the world. There's no anxiety or depression on display, knowing that she committed this horrific murder of a child and exhibits no concern at all of being discovered, reveals her inner psychopath. One of the trademarks of psychopathy is manipulation and chronic lying, and how they believe they are smarter than everyone else in the room. Alyssa Bustamante goes from denying knowing anything about Elizabeth's disappearance to attempting to sell a story about her accidentally killing the little girl. It is only when she is faced with the evidence they have on her that she cracks and breaks down into any sign of genuine emotion. But the emotion is not for Elizabeth. It is for herself. After the confession, Detective Rice leaves the room briefly. Alyssa Bustamante turns to the juvenile officer Toby Meyer with authentic terror and trepidation in her face and voice and asks, "What are they going to do to me?" It is difficult not to feel some ounce of compassion for this teenage girl who is now petrified. But her concern is not for Elizabeth and her family. This outburst of emotions revolved around what was going to happen to her now that the hideous truth of her crime was uncovered. Now, whether or not her apology to the family during her sentencing hearing was sincere or not, only Alyssa knows, but I am sure that it was brought on by the advisement of her attorney. Expressing guilt and remorse over one's violent actions can only benefit the outcome, not harm it. Yet it didn't seem to make any difference in the sentence she was given, nor in the parole board denying her conditional release. In previous episodes, I have discussed the matter of the juvenile waiver. For those of you new to the podcast or who need a refresher on the subject, it's a legal procedure for a juvenile to be tried as an adult instead of a minor. There are several different ways this can be done. First, there are discretionary waivers, where a judge solely decides whether a juvenile will be charged as an adult. This requires an official hearing in which evidence is presented from both the prosecutor and the juvenile's defense counsel. The judge then determines the offender's potential for rehabilitation based on various factors of the case, including any prior delinquent behavior. Secondly, there are mandatory or statutory waivers, which are laws that are established by a state that mandate a juvenile be charged as an adult for specific felony offenses. These traditionally include more serious violent crimes like homicide and rape, but in certain states they can encompass even nonviolent crimes like drug trafficking. The third type of juvenile waiver is known as a prosecutorial waiver. These differ from judicial since they don't require an official hearing to present the factors of the case under consideration. Instead, these waivers are solely up to the prosecutor's judgment, which gives them the power to directly file a case against a juvenile in adult court. This last transfer or waiver process is highly controversial and is at the forefront of much discussion regarding the fairness of how these laws are implemented, specifically surrounding issues of racial disparity. Scholars and critics also point out how the likelihood of recidivism among juveniles prosecuted as adults significantly increases once a minor is handled as an adult in the system. It removes a minor from the jurisdiction of a juvenile court system and allows a state prosecutor to charge an individual under the age of 18 as an adult. The age at which a child can be transferred to criminal court, also referred to as adult court, varies widely from state to state. Many states have legislation that sets the age at 14, but others allow the transfer for children as young as 10 for more serious offenses. For example, in California, this age is strictly set at 16, whereas in Arizona, there is no minimum age. In Missouri, where this crime took place, the minimum age is 12 years old. This means that if a 12-year-old commits any felony, the court can petition to relinquish the rights of the juvenile court. It is required that a hearing be set in order to properly and thoroughly determine whether the child should be handled by the juvenile system or they should be tried in criminal court as an adult. Before any official hearing, a written report must be prepared for consideration to transfer. This includes everything from a child's history, delinquent record, the offense, any prospect for rehabilitation, amongst other factors. If the court determines that the child cannot be properly handled in the juvenile system, as decided in the case of Alyssa Bustamante, the child will then be transferred to adult court. Once a minor is transferred to criminal court, they are forever seen and therefore treated as an adult. In other words, if they are tried as an adult once, then they will always be handled as an adult. The only exception to this rule is if the juvenile is found not guilty. Then the child will revert back to the juvenile system if and when they have committed a future offense. Research has shown that only harm can come to a juvenile housed in an adult jail or prison. Not only are these facilities not designed to hold kids, but there is nothing positive for juveniles to gain from their growing up behind bars. Youth need and require certain types of services and programs that they cannot receive in adult confinement. Jails and prisons are not set up to provide juvenile offenders with sufficient education. Their services and programs don't address their health and medical needs, nor can they fulfill their specific requirements for potential rehabilitation. Everything from classification tools to facilities and programs are inappropriate for treating youth because it does not address their unique stages of development. It is impossible to deny that adolescence is a formative stage for human beings, and each stage of growing up brings with it a unique set of challenges, vulnerabilities, and needs that differ greatly from those of adulthood. Juveniles in institutions for adult incarceration suffer greatly from being thrown in with adults. They are exposed to career criminals and violent offenders, including predators. The research shows that kids inside prison walls are more likely to commit crimes, in particular more serious offenses, once they are released. They are also the most likely to become victims of physical and sexual assault. There is no data on the percentage of girls assaulted in adult facilities, but the rate inside state and local juvenile facilities is disproportionately high. Girls comprise approximately 15% of youth within juvenile facilities, yet one study revealed that they represented 26% of all cases of abuse. Even more alarming was a study that showed 51% of the cases of abuse that were perpetuated by staff members were committed against girls. Given that the majority of female offenders, both youth and adult, are victims of physical and or sexual abuse and trauma, these girls and young women face a disproportionately high risk of being re-victimized once they are placed in the adult system. Statistics on this particular group of offenders also shows that due to their past history of abuse and trauma, they have a significantly high rate of emotional instability and mental health disorders. Youth and adult jails and prisons are also more vulnerable to self-harm and suicidal ideation. Offenders under the age of 18 are much more likely to kill themselves while in adult jail, with a rate of twice that of adults. It doesn't take an extensive period of incarceration either to break them mentally. In fact, 48% of these suicides occur within the first week. Juveniles are also frequently isolated from adults in jail, which only lends to escalating their mental and emotional instability, increasing their risk of suicide. Now, it's important to realize that the vast majority of youth are not being transferred to adult criminal court. From its peak seen in the mid-1990s, when the development of such juvenile waivers increased in number and harshness, with most juveniles being transferred for non-violent drug offenses, the percentage of teenagers or minors being waived has declined by over 700%. The data, however, varies greatly depending on the year and can fluctuate wildly depending on the state where the juvenile resides. It is estimated that between 200,000 and 250,000 youth under the age of 18 are transferred to criminal court every year. Male youth offenders were 8 times more likely to be waived to criminal court than female youth were. Between 2017 and 2024, there was much progress made in the areas of what were known as raise the age laws, which sought to minimize the number and age in which the criminal courts could handle juveniles. For example, both North Carolina and Louisiana had legislation which prevented a juvenile 16 years or younger from being considered an adult. But these laws have recently been reversed. As a result, this makes it even easier and has become more rampant for juveniles to be waived. There are roughly 4,600 juveniles being held in adult jail on any given night in the United States. Rehabilitation. Redemption. These two words, which once defined the purpose and structure of the penal system in the United States, and still do in many countries, now they feel almost surreal. They are so detached from our current crime control model. Our present-day penal system is centered around punishment and does little to help inmates develop and progress as human beings, whether they are ever eligible for parole or not. Should we be treating 12-year-olds as adults? Even in the most horrible and violent of cases, should we as a society be prosecuting a child as an adult? These questions are not answered easily. In the case of Alyssa Bustamante, she was only a few years older than the minimum age in Missouri when she was sentenced to life in prison for committing the most heinous crime imaginable. She brutally and viciously murdered a child when she was still a child herself, a disturbed, emotionally enraged, abused child. Does killing an innocent child mean that Alyssa Bustamante is incapable of being rehabilitated and therefore redeemable? It is not an easy question to answer. From someone who has a degree in criminal justice, I tend to think in general we overpenalize offenders in this country, including violent offenders. Our country has one of the highest rates of incarcerations in the world, period. No data shows anything positive about the current model employed. On the contrary, offenders who are incarcerated only become worse in our prisons, not better. It has often been said that even if someone is innocent of their crime, once they are imprisoned in our country, they will learn fast to become a criminal. We do little to nothing to identify and help heal the issues that lead offenders to be triggered in committing crimes. They are too often raped and abused by their fellow inmates and by prison guards. Our mental health care system inside and outside of prison is a joke, as evidenced by Alyssa Bustamante's treatment before the murder. We set up our convicts to fail and return to the system instead of preparing them for a life outside of it. No matter the severe degree of depravity, what does it say as a culture that we penalize kids to this extent? I understand we can't and shouldn't slap them on the wrist, so to speak, and send them to counseling for killing someone or committing any kind of violent offense. There are seriously dangerous and depraved children out there. Alyssa Bustamante proved to the world that she was a serious threat to others when she savagely murdered Elizabeth Olten. The vile words she expressed afterwards cast doubt on the concept that juveniles don't fully grasp the consequences of their actions based on their age and lack of cognitive development. Alyssa Bustamante fully understood that strangling, stabbing, and slitting a girl's throat and dumping her into a grave would end in her death. That was the entire purpose of her digging a grave, selecting a victim, and carrying out the crime. She also demonstrated full awareness and intelligence in how she plotted out the crime and manipulated and used her younger sister to be her unknown accomplice. There is no denying that every element of the crime was calculated and done with the sole intention of causing another's death. So how do we justify not keeping a twisted child killer like her locked away for life? How as a society do we take the chance of releasing her after 30 years, knowing that she may well have been fantasizing about her next kill once she is free? Maybe I am completely wrong, and time, in particular prison time, has set her on a different, sincere path. But psychopathy doesn't just go away. It's like the inner lining of her mind. She can conceal it from others, pretend it was just her tormented upbringing, and that as a full-grown woman after having served her time, she is no longer a threat to society. I am not a mother, at least not of any human children. I can't begin to comprehend the dark, endless well of emotions that Elizabeth Olten's mother was forced to endure after losing her precious baby girl, especially in such a horrifically violent manner. And even worse, by a neighborhood teenage girl. If I were her, I would wish only hell upon Alyssa Bustamante's every breathing moment and do everything in my power to ensure she is never freed. But again, this doesn't answer any question about how to handle children, including teenagers, in the justice system. It only invites more. How young is too young to be labeled an evil monster and be locked away for life? What age is appropriate to destroy the rest of a child's life when they commit the most atrocious of crimes? The only answer I do have is that each case must be handled on its own unique circumstances. Everything about the crime, the offender, the victim, any attempt to conceal it, the aftermath of being caught, the emotions or lack of shown by the juvenile. All elements must be carefully measured and looked at by different kinds of specialists and judges to thoughtfully and carefully determine how a child offender's crime and life should be handled. The justice system and its players holds incredible power over the direction of an offender's life, no matter their age. The worst thing and the most irresponsible thing they can do is not take under careful consideration how their decisions will make a lifetime impact on the child offender and their future. The other side stems from the other part of my degree, which is criminology. The calculated, cold, and sinister plan Alyssa Bustamante set in motion almost a week before fulfilling her fantasy. The repugnant words she spilled into her diary after the murder. Her diary was her trophy of the crime. If she hadn't felt the need to write down how amazing it was to kill someone, I highly doubt she would have ever been caught. On some levels, the most unsettling aspect of her as an offender can be visibly seen and heard within the interrogation video. She strikes off almost every box of psychopathy at only 15 years old. A lack of affect, no empathy, pathological lying, arrogant, manipulative, among the other well-recorded traits. Children can't be diagnosed with psychopathy since they have not reached full cognitive development. From what we know of the disorder, at least from what researchers have gauged based on other criminal psychopaths, something in a child's life helped to trigger the disorder. I have read some speculation about her having suffered sexual abuse. I have also read claims that she killed animals. Unless these come from the case or from her words, which neither of them have, I don't choose to presume either way. She mentioned burying dead animals, but she never said she killed them. I think some people out there want to paint her as this blossoming serial killer because, to them, that would make her even more captivating. What is known is that Alyssa Bustamante grew up in an emotionally turbulent, unstable, and violent household in her most formative years. I have often heard others say that doesn't explain or justify what she did. Of course not. Nothing ever could. But it is critical to understand from the perspective of criminology that not everyone has or has learned healthy coping skills. Alyssa Bustamante was hit with one trauma after another from before she was even born. Her resentment, rage, and depression, combined with her genetic propensity for violence and her emotional imbalance, caused her to boil over. She embraced darkness, violence, and became obsessed with death as she got older. Something made her completely detach from her emotional connection to others. Alyssa Bustamante was a budding psychopath, and no one noticed its formation until she had made her first kill. Does that mean she is still a psychopath, or is a psychopath even possible of changing? Do they have the ability to change or progress without the most extensive of therapy? Most research indicates that they can't. They are resistant to change and don't progress in therapy much, if at all. Could a child with psychopathy be different from an adult with the disorder? Is there a chance that once their brains are fully developed, they could be altered? It's impossible to know, especially given that juveniles can't be officially diagnosed. From what I have found about her life in prison, Alyssa Bustamante is a model prisoner. Her grandparents and even some of her siblings, including Emma, visit her. I came across an interesting article that referenced Alyssa Bustamante in relation to a woman who had spiraled downward after becoming addicted to meth. A military wife whose life, marriage, and family completely unraveled when she became a drug addict and was sent to prison. She met Alyssa Bustamante. And even though she was at first freaked out to meet the most infamous convict at Chillicothe Women's Prison, this woman saw something else in her. The two women fell in love and consider each other wives. This woman has since been released, but still visits Alyssa often. While performing research for this case, I noticed how there are quite a few Alyssa fans, supporters out there. I wouldn't be bothered by this fact if they wanted her to be free for the right reasons. Advocating for her parole based on the premise of juvenile justice and that she was a child when she committed the crime and they believe she should be given another chance would be one thing. If they believe she should be released because she has expressed genuine remorse and has taken major steps to prove that her life is worth saving, then maybe I could get behind it. But they are more fans than supporters. People who comment on her hot looks. People who express awe at what she did. These individuals are disgusting and as disturbing as the words she left behind in her diary. It's not at all surprising, though, given how many men and women have become obsessed and even get romantically involved with the most depraved and violent of criminals. I believe, as she has proven to be a real danger to herself and others, and is capable and would likely reoffend if given the opportunity. I have little doubt that if Alyssa Bustamante had not been caught at 15 years old, there would be a row of graves filled with the neighborhood kids of St. Martin, Missouri. Thank you so much for listening to part 2 of Two Graves in a Diary, a female thrill killer. I would love to hear what you have thought about these 2 episodes. I know I went into a lot of tangents this time, but I became very compelled and invested in this case and looking at it through different lenses. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for future episodes, I would love to hear from you. Please reach out. My contact information you can find in the episode description. Until next time, stay safe. And watch out for shades of murder happening on the streets. Next door. Especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, researched, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Original music, Stranger, composed by Stereo Code.